Ako 9-ročná som sa účastnila jednej recitátorskej súťaže.
The first time I entered the concert hall of the Slovakian Philharmonic Orchestra in Bratislava, I was 9 years old. There was an orchestra rehearsal taking place, and I was excited by the glistening chandeliers, the organ pipes, and by the orchestra. I said to my mother, "Mama, I would also like to play here one day." But my mother explained to me that I would never be able to be a member of the orchestra because only men were accepted. I decided there and then that if I couldn't play in the orchestra because I was a woman, then I could play as a soloist, but I would have to practice to be able to play the violin better than all the other violinists in the orchestra. Many years later, I achieved my goal and was employed as a soloist of the Slovakian Philharmonic Orchestra, with which I played all the major violin concertos, including the Tchaikovsky, Brahms and Mendelssohn concertos. I represented Czechoslovakia in 13 international violin competitions and brought many prizes home. In order to compete at an international competition at that time, I had first to win a national competition among around 30 other violinists in Prague who also wanted to participate in the competition. The Czech Ministry of Culture would then finance my participation at the competition. In this way, I took part in several international competitions, including the Jacques Thibault competition in Paris, the Tchaikovsky competition in Moscow, and the Sibelius competition in Helsinki. When I was 18 years old, I was selected by audition to be the leader of the European Youth Orchestra in London. Many concerts followed in London, and also solo recitals in Paris, Amsterdam, Rome, Moscow, Berlin, Vienna, Budapest, Tokyo, Singapore, and Rio de Janeiro. And so it followed that I travelled around the world for 30 years, giving regular concerts in 60 different countries throughout Europe, Asia, Africa, Australia, and North and South America. This required 6 to 8 hours of violin practice every day.
Takže aj som veľa videla, ale všetko za všetkým bola veľká drina. Teraz by som vám rada predstavila svoje.
Now I would like to introduce you to my collection of film cameras. This is a classical film camera which I bought for myself in 1968 when I began my travels around the world. My reason for buying the camera was to be able to show my parents everything which I saw. The Mexican port of Acapulco is one of the most beautiful along the Pacific coast. The port is 400 kilometers from Mexico's capital, Mexico City. When we came here twice in the month of October in 1979, we were literally pouring with sweat. The guests gather around a place called Quebrada, which became well known because young 18 to 20-year-old youths dive from a height of 35 meters into a narrow bay in the ocean. It is surrounded by steep cliffs. Because diving was so dangerous, the young men would always pray before diving. They took this risk for a mere $10, which they sometimes received from American tourists. We as artists and sportsmen were allowed to travel abroad to countries of the West during the communist regime, but private people were not allowed to travel. So my films were the only possibility for me to show my parents what I had liked in the world.
Buenos Aires, najväčšie mesto Južnej Ameriky.
Buenos Aires, the largest city in South America, has 9 million inhabitants. Here you see the Houses of Parliament with an 80-meter high tower of bronze. The avenue, which is called the 9th of July, is the widest street in the world. Perhaps this street reminds you of the Champs-Élysées in Paris. That was also my first thought. But this street is even wider. It has 16 lanes for cars in both directions and also enough space for cars to park.
No a keďže som filmovala veľmi veľa,
because I made so many movies, after 4 years of heavy usage, my second video camera broke. Since I loved the camera so much, I bought exactly the same model again. A few years later, I bought another newer Sony model. My last camera, and the one which I still use today, I bought with the honorarium which I received for my last concert tour in Japan, where I played the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto. The video camera is a Sony Digital 1000.
Keď sme boli v tom Rio de Janeiro,
When I was in Rio de Janeiro in 1994 with my 8-year-old son Paul, we went to Corcovado in order to see the great statue of Christ. After viewing the statue from where the cable car had left us, we had a look in the souvenir shops. Suddenly I called out, "Paul," but there was no answer. My little son had disappeared. You can imagine how anxious I became. Paul was only 8 years old and Rio de Janeiro has 8 million inhabitants. I immediately informed the police, and for 3/4 of an hour I was worried sick about my son. Luckily, he soon afterwards reappeared in the company of an elderly English couple at the place where I had last seen him. What had happened? My son had been looking at little model cars when he saw a lady wearing similar clothes to me getting on a bus. Paul was convinced that it was me and immediately began to run after the bus. But after the 3rd stop, he gave up following the bus and started to cry. An English couple asked him why he was crying, and Paul explained to them in English what had happened, and told them that his mother had gone away in the bus and that he did not know the name of the hotel in which they were staying. The English couple assured him that his mother was certainly not in the bus and was waiting for him at the spot where he had last seen her. They told him they would take him back to where he was with his mother. They then brought him back, and I was indeed waiting there for him. Since that time, I always wrote Paul's name and the address of the hotel we were staying in on his trousers. My son mostly travels with me. When I spent 2 weeks touring Japan, he came with me. I also took him many times to North and South America, to Paris, Rome, London, Vienna, and Egypt. My son is now 16 years old and has already traveled to 5 different continents. We make a perfectly matching duo.
My pochádzame z Nového Mesta nad Váhom.
This is our family home in Nové Mesto nad Váhom. My father was a lawyer and loved classical music. Every evening after work, he loved to play the piano for a couple of hours. He also played the organ every Sunday in church for 40 years. This is my mother, the best mother in the world. My mother was a very talented artist. She would have liked to study art, but her family did not have enough money for this. My mother painted these paintings when she was 16 years old. My mother, Olga, studied at a German economics and trade school. She could speak and write perfect German, Slovakian, and Hungarian. She could even write shorthand in all 3 languages. She worked in a trade company, then in a bank, and finally in an estate agency. Unfortunately, my mother is dead, but my father is still alive. He is 89 years old. I also have my 16-year-old son and my brother Igor. Like me, Igor is also a musician and has been playing in the Slovakian Philharmonic Orchestra for the last 33 years. We played together in a string quartet, and during its 10-year existence, we gave many beautiful concerts in Spain, France, Germany, Austria, Italy, and Scandinavia. Between 1976 and 1988, in my spare time, I enjoyed giving concerts on board the luxury cruise ships of the Norwegian shipping company, Royal Viking Lines. It was a ship with 500 guests, 360 crew, and around 30 artists on board. For each day on board, every passenger had to pay about $1,000 American. It was a lucky coincidence that I came to play on board this luxury liner. I was once making a television recording in the Hotel Kiev in Bratislava with the Women's Chamber Orchestra, and it just so happened that an American impresario called Brian Beaton, who had been talent spotting for artists for the ship, appeared in the hall. He asked me if I would like to give concerts for the guests on board the luxury cruise liner Royal Viking Star. I accepted, and a few days later I received a contract for a trip to Copenhagen, Hamburg, Helsinki, Stockholm, Leningrad and Amsterdam. I took casual clothing with me for my stay on board the ship, but also elegant clothes for my concerts. On the first day of my stay on board, to my surprise I discovered that most of the guests were very rich Americans who wore one set of clothes in the dining hall at lunchtime and another in the evening. My concerts were very well received, and 2 weeks into the journey, when every passenger was given a questionnaire to fill out, which included a question asking whether the passengers had enjoyed my concerts, I was praised by all the guests. I was therefore immediately invited to give further concerts. With time, I reached such an influential position giving concerts on the ship that I was able to choose my itinerary and bring on board with me my own accompanist and even my brother. On one occasion, I said that I wished to travel on the around-the-world journey. On another, that I wanted to spend the whole summer traveling through the Norwegian fjords, because the landscape was so beautiful. I played for a total of 12 years on board the luxury cruise ships. Then in June 1988, shortly after I had arrived home to record the Bruch Violin Concerto with the Slovakian Philharmonic Orchestra for a German CD label, on the day of my father's 75th birthday, an unexpected thing happened. My father had a stroke. I immediately cancelled all my trips and stayed at home in order to look after him. I never again went to play on board the cruise liners. After my father's stroke, it was very important that I stayed at home. On the day of his stroke, the doctors told me that my father would not survive longer than 24 hours. I didn't want to believe them and was prepared to fight for my father's life with all my strength. And for half a year, I visited my father in hospital 3 times every day for many hours. And of course, I had no time to practice the violin. My father was in intensive care for 2 months. The next 6 months he spent in a rehabilitation center, where he was taught how to stand up and how to take a few steps with the help of a walking stick. When he finally came home, he was permanently paralyzed down the right side of his body. That was more than 14 years ago. Since then, I have cared for my father so successfully that he is still alive today, even though 14 years ago the doctors had given him only 24 hours to live. Many violinists can play the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto, but only some can play it in such a way that the performance cannot be forgotten. The listener must be touched by the beauty of the sound and should be reminded of strong emotions. Producing a beautiful sound is not something which can be taught. It is a gift you are born with. Left-hand technique can be learned. It's just a matter of practice. David Oistrakh, who for me is the greatest violinist of all time, made such a beautiful and distinctive tone that it is possible to immediately distinguish his violin playing. Vasha Psychoda, a great Czech violinist, wrote in his books that 95% of a violinist's success lies in hard work and 5% in talent. It's true. Every violinist who performs on stage as a soloist practices 6 to 8 hours every day. It is very hard work and a life which demands many sacrifices. Musicians must travel a lot and stay in a different hotel almost every evening. They must always be well prepared, regardless of whether they are performing in a small or large city. A musician is always exposed to the critique of the public. After I completed my postgraduate studies with Professor Oistrakh at the Tchaikovsky Conservatoire in Moscow, I returned to Bratislava and began to teach at the Music Academy. I had 5 students, all of whom obtained respected positions after completing their studies. Rudolf Kandel is a member of the Slovakian Philharmonic Orchestra. Hanka Hrochova teaches violin at the Zilina Conservatoire. Milan Kijovsky teaches at the Košice Conservatoire. Peter Strenacik in Banska Bystrica. Ilse Jakobsen works in Copenhagen. I have been teaching the violin for 18 years at the University for Music in Vienna. I teach about 16 students every year. Many of my students are now playing in the Vienna Philharmonic and the Vienna Symphony Orchestras. One of my best students was Birgit Kolar, who managed to become the first female leader of the Vienna Symphony Orchestra. Today she leads the Bavarian Radio Orchestra.
Na husle ma učilo hrať 10 profesorov.
I have studied the violin with 10 different teachers. My favorite teacher was Alban Virtiel, who taught me at the Bratislava Conservatoire. He prepared me to play the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto for my diploma exam. I also held in high regard my violin professor at the Music Academy in Vienna, Professor Ricardo Odnoposov. He always came to the lesson with his Guarnieri del Gesù violin and played us all the pieces so perfectly that it was as though he were making a recording. I then studied for 5 years with Professor Plotzek at the Academy of Musical Arts in Prague. I am grateful to Professor Oistrakh, with whom I studied during my postgraduate studies at the Tchaikovsky Conservatoire in Moscow. For 5 years, I was always amazed by his playing, which was so magnificent that all violinists wanted to imitate him.
Všetci úsvisti mladí snažili napodobniť. Ku mne chodí už povedzme jedna.
I have given frequent concerts in Japan. Until now, 5 concert tours in total. I have also taught in Japan, and many Japanese violinists travel to Bratislava to have lessons with me. Mrs. Miyauchi, for example, has been coming to Bratislava to have lessons with me for the past 12 years, every time she has to prepare for concerts in Japan. She is the leader of the symphony orchestra in Kochi. I have performed the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto as well as Mozart's Sinfonia Concertante with this orchestra. In 1 month's time, I will again fly to Japan to teach.
Keď som sa pred asi 20 rokmi prvýkrát dostala do New Yorku, tak som sa pozerala na Manhattan z lode.
The first time I saw New York 20 years ago, I arrived by boat and could see only half of the Twin Towers. The upper parts were covered by clouds. These 2 buildings, which today no longer exist, were the second highest in the world and were called the World Trade Center. Each building had 110 stories and was 450 meters in height. At any one time, 100,000 people were employed within these buildings. There were 25 restaurants, which could accommodate 20,000 guests. There were many offices within the buildings, including those of the Norwegian shipping company, Royal Viking Lines. So many meters of cable were used inside the World Trade Center that if you joined them all together, they could go once around the world.
V reštauráciách môže byť obslužených naraz 20 000 hostí.
Pred rokom, keď som tam bola s mojím synom Pálkom,
When I was in New York 2 years ago with my son, we were on the 110th floor of the World Trade Center. From there we had a wonderful view of Manhattan. We were amazed by how huge and stable the buildings were. Naturally, today we look back and think that we could never have known how easily everything could crumble.
Tak rýchlo sa to všetko zničilo. No a čo sa mi veľmi páčilo, tie prírodné krásy, a síce Grand Canyon, kde som si zaplatila z helikopterov taký let.
I made this recording in California at the Grand Canyon. I went on a helicopter tour and we flew into the Grand Canyon and landed there. We were astounded by how the Colorado River had managed to erode the rock.
Keď som prvýkrát bola 3 týždne v Spojených štátoch a precestovala ich, tak som si povedala, že jediné mesto, kde by som si vedela zvyknúť žiť.
20 years ago, as I was traveling through North America, I saw many cities. I used to think that if I ever had to live in America, I would choose San Francisco, because many houses, which are built in a Victorian style, remind me of Europe. San Francisco is my favorite city in America. It is a cosmopolitan city with around 10 million inhabitants. 1 million of whom are Chinese, but there are also many Europeans. It has a nice climate and is a comfortable city for Europeans. San Francisco was built in a beautiful hilly region. All the streets run up and down the hills, which we knew from the TV serial The Streets of San Francisco. Now we can see our ship, the Royal Viking Sea, as she docks at the port in San Francisco. We are now crossing the Golden Gate Bridge, where each driver must pay a toll in order to cross. It is a technical wonder, as the bridge is built 250 meters above the ocean.
V 250-metrovej nadmorskej výške.
Not a single day passed by during the 16 years I spent abroad that I did not phone home. No matter whether I was in Los Angeles, Rio de Janeiro, Tokyo or Sydney, I phoned home to my parents. That shows a longing for home, homesickness. Home cannot be replaced by anything, not by money, beautiful shops or good company. You need to feel that you belong somewhere, that you have a permanent home.
Dobrý pocit toho domova. Ja som, povedzme, keď som skončila.
When I finished my postgraduate studies in Moscow, I had received a total of 3 diplomas from different universities, Vienna, Moscow and Prague. I returned home and taught for 4 years at the Music Academy in Bratislava. Naturally, I wanted to have a permanent position at home, and when the opportunity arose to travel abroad on concert tours. I was happy working at the Music Academy, but then on the 1st of July 1979, when I needed the Music Academy's permission to be able to play concerts on board the luxury cruise ship for the summer months, I was suddenly faced with a problem. One of my colleagues, Milos Jurkovic, had taken over as dean and did not want to allow me to undertake the ship cruise. He was very envious of my concert engagements and trips. I was sad, but nevertheless I managed to go on the cruise ship. To get my own back, on October 1st I auditioned for the position of leader with the Danish Radio Symphony Orchestra. I competed with 52 violinists and was offered the job. The next day I signed the contract with the orchestra in Copenhagen and wrote a letter of resignation to the Music Academy in Bratislava. In Denmark I had very good working conditions, a high salary, a beautiful apartment, and the Danish broadcasting company even paid the expenses of my trips back home to Bratislava. Everyone who visits Copenhagen wants to visit Tivoli Park. I was no exception. Please take a look at the world-famous entertainment park with me. There are water fountains with bubbles. The white building is a concert hall. It has a capacity for 1,500 people. Here is the big wheel. We are now turning on the big wheel. The work in Copenhagen was very interesting. Artists such as Rostropovich and Gidon Kramer came to play with the orchestra, but I still wanted to work closer to home. During that year, I gave many solo concerts. On average, I played around 120 every year. I regularly played as a soloist in the abonnement concerts of the Slovakian Philharmonic Orchestra, and I gave concerts in Cuba, Germany, and Finland. While I was making a recording with my string quartet for the Finnish Broadcasting Company, a letter arrived for me in Bratislava inviting me to audition for the position of leader with the Mozarteum Orchestra in Salzburg. I returned to Bratislava from Finland 1 day before the day of the audition. There was not much time, but the next day I travelled to Salzburg. In order to travel abroad, I had to obtain special permission from the authorities, which was not an easy task in the communist regime. Anyway, I arrived in Salzburg 3 hours after the beginning of the auditions and entered the building which houses the concert hall of the Mozarteum Orchestra, only to find that the auditions had just finished. I asked the orchestral manager whether I could still play so that I had not travelled 400 kilometers from Bratislava in vain. He replied, "If you unpack your violin and play immediately, you may take your place on stage." I immediately played the required pieces. I played excerpts from Mozart and Brahms symphonies, Ravel's Tzigane, and the Mozart A major and Tchaikovsky violin concertos.
Tak som vybavila husle, hneď som hrala. Keď som dohrala, tak potom aj moje body sa sčítali.
Half an hour later, I found out that I had succeeded in getting the job ahead of 10 other violinists. To celebrate, I went with my brother for ice cream. I then phoned my mother to tell her the news, and she was upset that once again I would be living far from home. I assured her, however, that it would only be for 1 year. In Salzburg, I worked as leader of the Mozarteum Orchestra for a full 15 years. I often played the violin concertos of Brahms, Tchaikovsky and Mozart as soloist with the Mozarteum Orchestra in the large hall of the Festspielhaus. Due to the world-renowned reputation of the Mozarteum Orchestra, half of the orchestra was permanently on tour somewhere in Japan, the United States or somewhere within Europe. During the concert tours, as well as leading the orchestra, I often played Mozart's violin concertos as soloist. I wanted to audition to lead the Slovakian Philharmonic Orchestra, but the conductor, Mr. Slovak, did not want to accept a woman to lead the orchestra.
Pred 2 rokmi som robila kurz pre Japoncov vo Viedni.
2 years ago, I led a course for Japanese students in Vienna. With the money which I earned, I walked into a travel agency and said, "Tomorrow I would like to fly somewhere. It doesn't matter where, as long as it is in the south and the sun is shining." The travel agency told me, "Tomorrow morning you can fly to Crete." I bought the airline ticket and flew there, but had not arranged any accommodation. The bus left from the airport and stopped in a small town called Rethymnon. I got off the bus and looked for a hotel. After I had found one, I went for a walk. The city was very romantic, with many cute narrow streets and a beautiful harbour. In the harbour were many restaurants serving freshly caught fish. My favourite food in Greece was moussaka with Greek salad. The first day, I passed by a music shop where I saw lots of folk music but no classical music. When I was about to leave the shop, the owner asked me what I was looking for, and I asked whether they also sold classical music. He said yes, and that he could recommend me an excellent CD. He handed me the CD, and I read, "Jela Spitkova plays Mendelssohn and Bruch's violin concertos." Of course I laughed, and the owner asked me why I was laughing. I told him because he had given me one of my own recordings. He didn't believe me and asked me if I was really Jela Spitkova. I said yes and showed him my passport. I have 30 violin concertos in my repertoire, including the concertos of Beethoven, Tchaikovsky, Mendelssohn, Bruch, Bach, Vivaldi, Dittersdorf, Suk, Dvorak, Sibelius, Haydn, Mozart and Lalo. I have played these concertos on 350 different occasions with one orchestra or another in various countries throughout Europe, America and Asia. I have made recordings of many of these concertos, and wherever I go, I find my CDs in the shops. In Japan or Singapore, Paris, Rome or London. It is a very pleasant feeling. There is no nicer moment than the end of a concert. There is absolute silence in the hall, and then the applause starts. Then you play an encore, and the applause continues. Then you play a second encore, and a third and a fourth. You can see that you have given something beautiful to your audience during the concert, which they appreciate. You can go home feeling that you have done a good deed.